A flight attendant tried to intimidate a black CEO mid-flight, but the CEO turned the situation around in a way that left everyone in the cockpit stunned. A flight attendant beat a black CEO with an emergency axe, thinking the weapon would give him total control. He didn't realize the CEO would rise, take the same axe, and turn the entire aircraft against its own attacker. The moment steel touched his back, the cabin's fate flipped forever. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true strength refuses to fall. The moment the cabin door sealed shut, Dr. Arven Kassel adjusted the cuff of his charcoal-gray jacket and exhaled through his nose. There was no room for error today. Not at 34,000 feet. Not when the future of Veylorix Dynamics, his company, his vision, rested on the encrypted tablet he had just powered on. Seat 2. A offered a perfect vantage point. A quiet corner of first class, buffered from the noise of boarding. The cabin interior of SkySpan Flight 907 was sleek, modern, unnervingly sterile. Blue accent lights pulsed softly above him like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Outside the oval window, the final rays of morning sun caught the wing's polished edge as the aircraft pushed off the tarmac. Arven didn't smile. He wasn't here for scenery. The tablet in his lap blinked to life, unlocking with a thumbprint and biometric scan. He scrolled through layers of schematics, wireframes of a chip no one outside his inner circle knew existed, an emergency override aviation module designed to outpace and replace obsolete flight control systems. If deployed, it would shift the power balance across the aviation industry. And someone knew it. Weeks earlier, an anonymous message had arrived in the company's encrypted inbox. Just 2 lines. Your skies won't stay clear forever. Some doors were never meant to be opened. Veylorix security flagged it as a low threat. Arven didn't. He'd lived too long in boardrooms where sabotage wore the smile of a colleague. That's why he chose to fly alone. Why he didn't tell his board. Why this mid-air briefing, encrypted and isolated, mattered more than anything else right now. He felt it again, the pressure behind his ribs. Not quite fear. Not yet. A shadow passed in his peripheral vision. The flight attendant moved with deliberate slowness. Tall, square-shouldered, mid-30s. Name tag, Redden Cole. He passed by with the practiced neutrality of airline staff, but something was off. His pace slowed as he neared Arven's seat. His gaze dropped not to the safety cards or seatbelt signs, but to the faint glow of Arven's tablet screen reflected in the cabin wall. Arven caught the glance. Their eyes didn't meet. Not exactly, but something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or intent too raw to mask. Redden walked on, but lingered 1 row too long before disappearing into the forward galley. Arven's brow furrowed. He had made a habit of cataloging subtle shifts in behavior. That glance hadn't been idle. That pause wasn't routine. And still, he reminded himself, paranoia had no place in logic. He breathed through the tension, minimized the tablet, and focused on the file headers. Another figure entered the cabin. A second attendant. Nameplate. Merrick Solvor. Leaner, paler, quiet. He leaned in as Redden emerged, and the two exchanged a whisper that barely lifted above the white noise. Merrick's gaze followed the direction of Redden's nod, straight toward Arven. And for a second too long, Merrick watched him. Not with curiosity, with calculation. Arven stiffened. He adjusted his seat back an inch not to relax but to reset posture. A reflex from years of negotiation. Never let discomfort show. He tapped a command, pulling up a diagnostic encryption readout. Still secure, still locked, still his. But something else wasn't. The aircraft lifted through light turbulence and the captain's voice filtered through the speakers, calm but unfamiliar. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard SkySpan Flight 907. Please note, due to some unexpected personnel rotations, some crew may be operating outside their usual assignments today. We appreciate your understanding, and thank you for flying with us." Arven blinked. Unexpected rotations? That wasn't standard language. Flight protocols didn't announce internal scheduling changes, not unless someone wanted to preemptively excuse something, or someone. He tapped off the tablet and quietly slid it into his carry case, eyes locked on the leather flap as it sealed. His heart wasn't racing. Not yet. But a signal, ancient and evolutionary, had sparked inside him. That announcement wasn't about courtesy. It was a warning wrapped in politeness. His hand lingered near the latch of the case. The aluminum zipper felt colder than usual, like metal anticipating pressure. He slowly reached down and buckled the flap, fingers steady, movements controlled. Just as he clicked the final clasp, a flicker of movement at the galley door caught his attention. Redden stood there again, not moving, watching. Their eyes met fully this time. It wasn't a confrontation, not yet, but Arven saw it in the set of the jaw, the way the man's hand hovered near the inside of his vest, not reaching, just remembering something hidden. He turned his head, pretending to look out the window. His reflection stared back in the plexiglass. Composed, steady. But he wasn't alone in his reflection. He could see Redden behind him, in the mirror glint of the glass, unmoving. The quiet had teeth now. Inside his mind, Arven cataloged what he knew. A sensitive document, a non-standard crew, a pointed announcement, 2 attendants watching him like assigned sentries. And that final detail. When he closed the tablet, Redden's posture shifted, tightened, as if he knew exactly what was inside that case. The thought formed slowly, like a ripple becoming a wave. Someone didn't want this flight to stay routine, and he was no longer sure who had boarded this plane to serve, and who had boarded it to stop him. He adjusted the case beside him, calmly, deliberately. Then he sat back in his seat, eyes half closed, heart steady, not with peace, but preparation. He sensed the storm before a single drop had fallen. The call button chimed. Arven Kassel didn't look up at first, but he registered the weight of Redden Cole's presence before he saw him. The flight attendant's footsteps didn't match the usual rhythm. They were too measured, too deliberate. When the water bottle hit the tray table with a loud, deliberate thud, Arven raised his gaze slowly. Redden stared down at him, face blank but eyes sharp with something that didn't belong on a commercial flight. Mockery, challenge, a silent dare. "Thank you," Arven said calmly, voice firm but composed. His fingers remained wrapped around the edge of the tray, knuckles tight. Redden lingered a moment too long. His smile didn't move his eyes. Then he turned away without a word, vanishing down the aisle like a ghost that wanted to be noticed. Arven didn't drink the water. His gaze followed Redden's path. The man stopped twice, once to adjust an overhead bin that had already been sealed at takeoff, and again to check a passenger's seatbelt with unnecessary force. Neither action served a real purpose. Arven clocked both. He leaned slightly, just enough to glimpse over his shoulder toward the rear galley. That's when he saw it. Merrick Solvor, the other attendant, knelt near a small, innocuous-looking cabinet. The movement was subtle, a twist of a key, a low click. Arven's pulse tightened. That cabinet contained emergency equipment, a fire extinguisher, oxygen tanks, and something else, the extraction axe. He turned back toward his tablet but didn't open it. Instead, his thoughts recalibrated. This was no longer about technology. It was about presence, about perception. The stillness in the air wasn't peace, it was a pause before rupture. Across the aisle, a man about Arven's age had taken notice. He had sharp eyes and an engineer's posture. Darren Valcor. Arven remembered his boarding. Quiet, courteous, traveling alone. Now, Darren subtly angled his phone camera toward the aisle. His thumb tapped the screen, activating the record function. No words were exchanged, but Arven saw the nod Darren gave him. They both felt it. Something wasn't right. The lights dimmed unexpectedly, casting long shadows across the rows. A low murmur spread among the passengers, but no one panicked. Not yet. The engine hum deepened slightly, too subtle for most to notice, but Arven's senses were tuned for the unusual. The aircraft felt heavier somehow, slower, as if burdened not by cargo, but by something unspoken. He reached down, quietly zipping his tablet back into its case. Redden passed again, this time not bothering to glance away. Arven met his stare, unwavering. It was a silent clash. Not physical, not yet, but territorial. Redden's smirk curled into something smug, like he was waiting, like he knew something Arven didn't, and that terrified Arven more than the axe. When patterns don't align with the setting, when crew members act like sentinels instead of stewards, when the cabin breathes unease, it's not coincidence. It's orchestration. Arven leaned back in his seat and exhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. Not to relax, to prepare. Because someone had set the clock ticking on a plan. He didn't know its full design, but he felt the contour of it pressing against the cabin's false calm. The uniforms, the routines, the water bottles and overhead bins. Every detail was camouflage. Darren glanced at him again. Arven gave the smallest nod in return. He wasn't alone. But he was still the target. Something was coming. And Redden Cole wasn't improvising. He was waiting for his signal. Arven's fingers curled around the armrest, tension anchored in his shoulders. He felt the trap tightening long before it snapped. The tray hit the table with a jarring clang that silenced half the cabin. Arven Kassel's fingers stilled beside his encrypted tablet. Water from the cup on the tray trembled with the force of the impact. Redden Cole, standing over him, didn't blink. His posture was tense, shoulders locked, arms rigid, as though suppressing something far more dangerous than frustration. Arven's expression didn't change, but inside, alarms were sounding. The flight attendant's words came next, low and deliberate, like a coded threat disguised in casual tone. "You think no one knows what you're carrying?" Passengers nearby turned slightly, reacting to the tension without understanding it. Arven looked up, his eyes sharp beneath his calm. "I expect professional conduct from this crew," he said, voice controlled, each syllable carved with quiet authority. But Redden didn't flinch. His jaw clenched tighter. The air between them thickened with a charge that words couldn't diffuse. Without another word, Redden turned and took 3 quick steps toward the equipment cabinet at the bulkhead. Arven's gaze followed, a second too late. The lock clicked open, not with a passcode, but a hidden key Redden had tucked into his sleeve. He yanked the cabinet open and, in one seamless motion, pulled out the emergency extraction axe. It gleamed dully under the cabin lights, functional, brutal, and completely out of place in a meal service. Arven's heart surged. The axe wasn't for show. Redden stepped forward with grim purpose. In that instant, the mask of professionalism dropped from his face, revealing something colder. Before Arven could fully rise, the flat side of the axe smashed across his left shoulder, the force knocking him sideways. His head collided with the partition wall, and a bright explosion of pain bloomed across his jaw. Gasps spread through the cabin like a brush fire. Trays clattered. A child cried out. In seat 3C, Darren Valcor fumbled with his phone and began recording. His hands shook, his voice a whisper into the camera. "The CEO. He's being attacked by the crew. He's bleeding." Arven's head spun, but he remained conscious. He tasted copper, blood. The left side of his face throbbed, but he forced himself up, bracing against the armrest. His hand slipped once, leaving a red smear on the white seat fabric, but he steadied. Across the aisle, Merrick Solvor blocked the path of a passenger trying to stand. "Stay seated," he barked. "He tried to access flight systems. We're handling a threat." The words were sharp and rehearsed, but absurd. Passengers froze in confusion, some glancing between Merrick and the blood now dripping down Arven's collar. The lie hung in the air like smoke, thick, choking, but not yet believed. Redden wasn't finished. He advanced again, axe raised. Arven moved just in time. The blade grazed his hand instead of splitting it. A sharp line opened across his palm, red and raw. Pain shot through his arm, but it sharpened his resolve. The cabin was no longer an aircraft. It had become an arena, and Arven was the only one not pretending anymore. He gritted his teeth, calculating. The attack wasn't an outburst. It was planned. The axe had been prepared. The cabinet unlocked. The blow precise. This wasn't about personal animosity. This was tactical. He wasn't just under assault. He was being removed. Why? His mind raced. The tablet, the schematics, the chip, yes, the emergency override chip. Revolutionary tech. He had opened it in flight, thinking it safe. Someone must have seen. Someone who knew what it meant. The potential. The threat it posed to other interests. Competitors. Rivals. Arven scanned the faces around him, passengers in shock, some rising, some shrinking back. Merrick still held the aisle. Redden towered above him, breathing heavy, hands tight on the axe. A flicker of pain shot through Arven's jaw, but his thoughts remained clear. If they wanted the tablet, they wouldn't destroy him entirely, which meant they needed him conscious. Maybe just long enough to retrieve what they were after. That gave him an edge, slim as it was. Redden lunged again, and this time, Arven ducked left, letting the handle slam into the side of his seat. The impact cracked the headrest and sent foam puffing into the aisle. Arven pivoted, his uninjured hand gripping the armrest for leverage. Redden stumbled half a step, enough for Arven to stand. Their eyes locked. This wasn't over. Behind them, someone screamed for the captain. But no one came. No voice answered. The intercom stayed silent. And in that silence, Arven realized something chilling. They weren't waiting for help. They were waiting for compliance. The attack had begun, and it wouldn't stop until either the cabin or the truth was silenced. The moment the axe swung, the truth finally revealed its teeth. The clang of steel against steel rang out like an alarm bell as Redden Cole's latest swing met the metal brace of the seat. Sparks burst into the air, and the sound echoed through the pressurized cabin, jolting passengers into a collective gasp. Arven Kassel had caught the swing with a movement born not of reflex, but of calculated survival. His arm, braced against the aisle-side frame, trembled under the force. Pain shot down his ribs, but he didn't yield. The axe was real, the danger deliberate, and the man attacking him was no longer hiding behind pretense. Redden's eyes flared with surprise. The expression on his face cracked for a split second. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from a man still recovering from the first 2 blows. He stepped back, adjusted his grip on the emergency axe, and tightened his stance like a trained striker, preparing to finish what he'd started. But something had shifted. Arven was no longer backing away. The resolve in his eyes mirrored steel, even as blood trickled from a cut just above his brow. "Remain seated. Do not interfere." Merrick Solvor's voice barked from behind the drink station, his tone commanding, frantic, desperate. "He tried to breach flight controls. This is a safety protocol." The lie dropped into the cabin like a stone into water, sending ripples of confusion among the passengers. Some looked at each other in doubt. A few obeyed instinctively and froze. But others, like Darren Valcor, knew better. Darren, phone steady in hand, whispered urgently into the mic. "He's lying. I've been filming the whole thing. The CEO is defending himself. They attacked him first." Redden didn't care. He raised the axe again, higher this time, his silhouette outlined in the dimmed overhead lights. Arven didn't wait. He shifted sideways, just enough to avoid the arc of the blade. The handle cracked into the headrest, splintering the plastic casing. Foam burst out in chunks. Arven moved on instinct, launching forward and gripping Redden's wrist with his good hand. His fingers locked tight, drawing on strength born from years of boardroom battles and crisis negotiations. Their struggle fell into silence, broken only by the hum of the engines and the labored breathing of two men locked in a fight beyond words. Redden's jaw clenched as he tried to yank free, but Arven leaned his weight into the hold, twisting just enough for the axe to drop. It landed on the carpet with a dull, haunting thud. Merrick broke from his post, sprinting down the aisle, but his foot clipped a loose bottle rolling across the floor. The fall was instant. He crashed into a seat with a grunt, arms flailing. The passengers gasped again, now fully shaken from the illusion of order. One man stood up. Another began shouting, "Stop him! The CEO's not the threat!" Arven didn't hesitate. He kicked the axe backward under a row of seats, far out of Redden's reach. His body screamed from the motion, but he pushed through the pain. Redden roared and lunged again, his arms swinging. Arven grabbed the nearest object, an unattended metal serving cart, and rammed it forward. It struck Redden in the gut and chest, staggering him back into the opposite row. The crash of the cart echoed like a cannon in the tight space. "Record this!" Darren shouted, his camera aimed dead on. "He's defending himself. He's stopping a hijack." The spell broke. Passengers stood up, some shouting, others shielding children. Merrick tried to recover control, shouting again about protocols, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of resistance. The lie he'd crafted had snapped under the weight of truth. Arven's bloodied shirt, the shattered headrest, the kicked-away axe, it was all visible, undeniable, and damning. But inside Arven's mind, there was no celebration. His breathing was ragged. His muscles screamed. But his thoughts were sharp, focused. He hadn't won. He had delayed. This wasn't over. He pressed his back against the bulkhead wall and scanned the aisle. Redden was recovering fast. Merrick was dazed, but not out. And the flight? Still in the air, still without answers. And the cockpit, sealed or unsealed, that mattered more than anything now. He needed to think, not react. Strategy over emotion, clarity over chaos. He wasn't fighting to win a brawl. He was fighting to retake control of something far more dangerous. A plane mid-air, a narrative twisting around him, and a corporate shadow reaching far beyond this cabin. And in that moment, with passengers rising and crew stumbling, Arven saw it. A narrow opening, a single pathway left. It wouldn't be through strength. It would be through decisive strategy. He straightened himself, jaw clenched, eyes clear, and stared down the aisle not as a victim, but as a man preparing for the next move. He realized the only way out was through the very danger set against him. The moment his foot hit the aisle carpet, Arven saw it, the cockpit door. It was slightly ajar, not locked. His heart spiked like a warning alarm. Merrick. That earlier dash to the front, he hadn't locked it. The oversight was unthinkable, the kind that only made sense in a hurry or in betrayal. Arven didn't hesitate. Pain screamed through his shoulder and ribs with every movement, but instinct overrode agony. He lunged forward, weaving through the narrow passage, his breath sharp and shallow, barely hearing the gasps and cries behind him. Redden shouted something unintelligible, but the sound faded as Arven threw himself toward the open cockpit threshold. He stumbled through the doorway, using his uninjured arm to slam it shut behind him. Then a click. He turned the manual lock fast, sealing himself inside. Only then did the silence register. The cockpit was dim, illuminated only by the glow of instrument panels. Autopilot was engaged, but the seat to the left, the pilot's seat, was empty. In the right-hand seat, the co-pilot slumped unnaturally to one side. Arven's eyes widened as he stepped forward, knees nearly buckling from the damage Redden had already inflicted. He reached the man, gently tilting his head. Jonas Threll. The name was on his badge. A tiny puncture wound marred the co-pilot's neck, almost invisible, but precise. Arven's gut twisted. This wasn't exhaustion or medical failure. It was calculated sedation. "Why is no one flying this plane?" he muttered aloud, panic slipping into his voice. He turned back toward the empty seat and dropped into it, wincing as his body protested. He grabbed the yoke like a reflex, grounding himself in the one action he knew was necessary: keep the plane steady. His eyes swept the dashboard. Autopilot held the aircraft stable for now, but the readings were off. No direct communication was active with ground control. Then came the sound, a heavy thud behind the door. Redden. Another slam followed, harder this time. Arven flinched but didn't move from the controls. His ears rang with the impact, but his thoughts churned louder. If Redden was willing to break down a cockpit door, the act wasn't about rage, it was about desperation. Which meant... Arven leaned over the panel, fingers scanning for anomalies. A blinking icon caught his attention. Not an alarm. Not an alert. A transmission log. He tapped it. There it was, an outgoing signal, time-stamped 32 minutes prior. It hadn't gone to the FAA, not to any air traffic control tower. It had been sent to a private encrypted frequency. The tag meant nothing to him, but its destination didn't belong to any civilian or government aviation network. Someone had sent the flight's data elsewhere, quietly, beneath the radar. A corporate handoff? Or worse, a hijack posing as an accident. Arven's pulse pounded in his ears. His encrypted tablet, still zipped inside his coat, contained the schematics for the override chip. But now he understood something far darker. They didn't want just the chip. They didn't want just the man. They wanted to erase both, mid-flight with no record of sabotage, just an unfortunate onboard event. Behind him, another loud thud. Redden roared from the other side of the door, fists or shoulders battering it with rhythmic desperation. Arven didn't turn. He stared instead at the blood smeared on the edge of the console, his own. The same blood that now stained the emergency axe resting at the side wall, left forgotten after the earlier assault. The very weapon meant to silence him was now within his reach. He didn't pick it up. Not yet. Instead, he looked at the blinking signal log one more time, then down at the physical relay switches beneath the main console. A faint hum vibrated from beneath the panel, power drawn not from the aircraft's primary system, but from an auxiliary feed line. Arven leaned lower, lips tightening. He reached beneath the panel and popped open a small maintenance hatch. Tucked inside, camouflaged among legitimate avionics, was a black module. Sleek, matte, humming faintly with green LEDs. Not factory standard. He knew that casing. It was a control suppression relay, designed to intercept manual overrides and reroute them to an external signal. It meant someone could guide the plane without touching the controls, or sitting in the cockpit. Arven felt like the oxygen had thinned. This wasn't a rogue attack. It was a systemized coup. Someone had planned for him to be on this plane, to suffer a disruption, to never reach his destination, personally or professionally. Redden had been the weapon. But this was the system that pulled the trigger. Another slam shook the cockpit door. Arven turned his head slowly toward the emergency axe. Still bloody, still sharp, his hand hovered over it. The cabin was in panic. The passengers likely didn't understand what was happening, but Arven did, and now he had a tool, a brutal, symbolic one. He wrapped his fingers around the axe's handle, lifting it slowly, the weight anchoring his trembling arm. Outside the door, Redden growled, his voice muffled but burning with intent. Inside, Arven stared at the glowing green module, the blinking log, the broken man slumped beside him, and the locked door. He could no longer just react. He had to retaliate. He stepped forward and muttered to himself. The axe wasn't the only thing they had armed. The cockpit swayed gently with the motion of the aircraft, but Arven Kassel's hands trembled for an entirely different reason. Pain laced up his left side from the earlier assault, and blood traced a slow path down his temple. but his mind remained focused, calm in the storm. He gripped the side of the console to steady himself, scanning the control board for the emergency communication override. His fingers hovered, then pressed. Nothing. No light. No signal. The system had been manually deactivated. Arven's breath slowed as realization coiled around him like a tightening wire. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was an orchestration, the kind executed by someone with access, leverage, and motive. He patted the inside of his coat and felt the encrypted tablet still zipped securely against his ribs. It wasn't just the aviation chip design that made him a target. It was what he represented, what he knew. He crouched beside the pilot's seat, ignoring the pain slicing through his ribs, and popped open the access panel beneath the avionics bay. A tangle of wiring blinked back at him, and amid it, too neatly integrated to be coincidence, was a small black box, wired deep into the flight systems. It blinked green, steady, deliberate, a relay transmitter. Arven's eyes narrowed. The device was disguised to look like standard equipment, but its architecture was foreign, non-regulation. It had been embedded into the system, not just to monitor, but to guide, to control. Remote guidance was underway, and that meant only one thing. The aircraft was not under SkySpan's command. Someone had hijacked the controls, and the cockpit was never meant to be reached by him, only emptied of him. Then the intercom crackled. "Dr. Kassel, you're delaying the inevitable. That cockpit wasn't meant for you." Redden's voice, cold, confident, and eerily calm as though they both knew the script had already been written. Arven didn't answer. He reached for the emergency axe lying at the base of the console, the same one Redden had used to crack his shoulder, now resting like a ghost of violence beside him. Its handle was warm from cabin heat and smeared with his own blood. The head still gleamed beneath the crimson stains. He stared at it for a long second, the hum of the aircraft mingling with his heartbeat. They had armed Redden with this tool to break him, to dismantle his body before stealing his work, his silence, his legacy. But they hadn't anticipated that he would survive, and worse, for them, retaliate. Arven pressed his palm against the console and stood up straight, swaying only slightly. Behind him, the cockpit door took another pounding, more desperate this time. He had bolted it, reinforced it. For now, it would hold. But the real battle wasn't against the door. It was against the lie wired into the veins of the aircraft itself. He crouched once more, gritting his teeth as he wedged the blade of the axe into the relay's casing. It cracked under pressure. Sparks flared briefly, warning lights danced across the panel above. The aircraft jolted, not violently but perceptibly, an echo of interference from a severed control. But Arven didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the wiring behind the relay. Every wire was a potential bomb or salvation. He traced the main conduit, followed it to a red-capped module marked with no official insignia. Just numbers. Meaningless, unless you knew what to look for. Arven did. The design matched one he had seen in an intelligence leak months ago, Carnexus Systems, the same rival corporation that had lost the Veylorix contract, the same firm that had everything to gain from discrediting or eliminating him. Now it was clear. This flight had been dressed up as routine, crude with uniforms and lies, and weaponized with silence. Redden and Merrick were plants. The crew's movements, the locked cabinets, the silent co-pilot, none of it was incidental. They hadn't wanted to kill him in the air. They wanted the flight to disappear into an accident, with no cockpit evidence, no survivors to contradict the press release. A clean story. A dirty plan. Arven reached back for the axe and, with a grunt of effort, pried the panel free from the main relay. The internal circuitry flared in protest. He could smell the faint burn of ozone and metal. With his other hand, he pulled at the emergency wiring, searching for an alternate signal route. The aircraft's systems had been crippled, but not killed. Not fully. There was still one layer of code beneath all this. one legacy protocol embedded in the early days of SkySpan design. If he could reach it. The cockpit door shuttered behind him again, followed by a slam, but Arven ignored it. He stared at the axe, blood-slick, breathless. "If they used this to silence me," he whispered, blade still in hand, "I'll use it to cut the lie open." The moment Arven Kassel wedged the emergency axe beneath the panel, he knew there was no turning back. Sparks flickered like tiny fireflies against the darkened cockpit walls as he forced the blade into the relay housing. The metal casing hissed in protest, groaning under the pressure. Every motion sent pain jolting up his ribs, but Arven gritted his teeth and kept going. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was dissecting the very machine they'd used to target him. The casing popped loose with a metallic crack. Beneath it lay a cluster of tight circuitry, unlike anything belonging in a standard SkySpan flight deck. Embedded within was a pulsing green module, wired directly into the avionics relay, a control suppression unit. Arven's eyes narrowed. The design was familiar, sleek, aggressively proprietary. "Carnexus," he muttered aloud, his voice hoarse but cold. His breath hitched. The revelation wasn't a shock, it was a confirmation. Carnexus Systems, the rival firm that had lost the billion-dollar integrity contract to Veylorix, had clawed its way into this flight not through brute force, but through technological sleight of hand. They hadn't just tried to destroy Arven's credibility, they had tried to erase him from the sky. The flight wasn't about taking his life alone. It was about taking control of the skies, the industry, the future. The axe he now held wasn't a weapon of violence, it had become his scalpel of truth. He repositioned the blade and struck downward into the conduit. A flash of blue-white light burst outward, followed by a sharp pop and curling smoke. The navigation display blinked violently, and then, for the first time since takeoff, flickered back into full manual control. A dull alarm tone echoed through the cockpit. The lockout had been severed. Behind him, the cockpit door shuddered with another violent bang. Redden Cole's muffled voice rang out through the steel. "He's cutting it open. He knows." Arven didn't flinch. He reached under the console, pulling up a forgotten emergency comm pad, the analog kind buried deep in the pre-digital layer of the aircraft's design. Veylorix engineers had fought to keep it in legacy systems for cases just like this. When the new failed, the old might still breathe. He toggled the emergency band, bypassing the tampered communications relay. His fingers shook, not just from injury but from the sheer magnitude of what he was trying to stop. Come on," he whispered, sweat beading on his brow. The system stuttered to life, displaying a faint pulse, a ping searching for acknowledgement. No one had built this override channel for convenience. Only someone who had studied the flight architecture from the inside out would even know it existed. Below the panel, the scorched relay core sizzled, smoke curling upward into the air. Arven didn't wipe it away. He stared through it, like a man watching illusions burn. This wasn't sabotage anymore. This was a digital execution plan, and he had interrupted it mid-sentence. Behind the door, Redden's voice returned, louder, panicked. "You don't know what you're doing. They'll kill the signal. You think anyone's listening?" Arven didn't respond. He was too focused on the signal pulsing on the screen, praying that someone, anyone, on the right frequency was awake enough to hear the whisper of a man carving his survival out of silence. But deep down, another voice in his head replied to Redden's threat with searing clarity. "I designed the fail-safes. I know where they buried the wires." Arven's hand tightened around the axe. The pain in his body dulled under the clarity of purpose. The tool they'd handed him in arrogance had become the key to unlocking the entire deception. He turned slowly toward the door, reinforced but groaning, and stared at it for a long moment. "You built this flight to erase me, but you gave me the one tool you shouldn't have." The attendant smirked, believing the blow had ended the fight, unaware that every witness, every regulation, and every ounce of the CEO's resilience was coming together for one explosive counterstrike. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when discipline meets unstoppable resolve, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Lights flickered in the narrow cabin as if the jet itself were blinking in disbelief. The autopilot had just disengaged, and a sharp mechanical chime sliced through the air, sending confusion spiraling through the rows of passengers. Then came the unmistakable hiss of oxygen masks deploying overhead, plastic cords swinging like vines in a mechanical jungle. Gasps turned to shouts. Seatbelts clicked open in a chorus of panic. In the rear galley, Merrick Solvor bellowed, "Remain seated. This is a controlled procedure." But the words fell flat. No one was listening anymore. Panic had broken through the calm like floodwater through a dam. Phones were raised, screens lit, passengers shouted over each other, demanding answers. Near the front, Redden Cole's composure cracked like ice under a blade. Rage contorted his face as he grabbed a full galley tray and sprinted to the cockpit. "Move!" he snarled, shoving aside a man attempting to intervene. The cockpit door, solid and sealed, stood like a final wall between his mission and its unraveling. He lifted the tray high and began battering the door with unfiltered aggression. The metal clanged under impact, the noise reverberating through the front cabin like thunder without lightning. Inside, Arven Kassel tightened his grip on the aircraft's controls. Blood from his lip trickled down his chin, tracing a path to his collarbone. A sharp sting pulsed from his temple. His left hand throbbed, wrapped now in a strip torn from his shirt. But his focus didn't waver. He had wedged the emergency axe, the very one used to attack him, between the locking gears of the cockpit door. It groaned under pressure, but it held. The radio remained static for a moment too long. Arven hunched over the console, patching through the old emergency band he had manually activated just minutes earlier. Then it crackled alive. "Flight 907, identity unconfirmed," came a distorted male voice. "Who is transmitting?" Arven didn't hesitate. "Dr. Arven Kassel. Civilian override. Aircraft is compromised. Control has been retaken. Emergency assistance required." His voice was controlled but urgent, cutting through the interference like a wire through ice. There was silence. Then, "Confirm recipient. SkySpan internal protocol. Level 8? His breath caught. That phrase was embedded deep within the contract specifications for a system his company had been about to finalize, information not yet public. It was a signal that someone, somewhere in SkySpan's oversight systems, was monitoring the protocol grid. Arven keyed in the confirmation. Outside, the cockpit door shook again under Redden's assault, but Arven didn't flinch. He locked eyes with the blinking alert on the screen. Coordinates were now being tracked. Someone had received him. He wasn't alone. The intercom beside him buzzed. Redden's voice hissed through, full of rage barely held back. "Dr. Kassel, you think you've won something? That cockpit wasn't meant for you." Arven didn't answer. He reached down slowly, picked up the axe that had nearly shattered his skull just hours earlier, and walked to the door. His hand gripped the steel handle with the weight of every betrayal behind him. With measured strength, he slammed the axe head into the seam of the cockpit door, not to destroy, but to reinforce. The blow drove the wedge deeper, jamming it with brutal finality. Behind him, cockpit panels blinked steadily. The aircraft was stable, for now, but the storm hadn't passed. Arven turned and stared at the cockpit ceiling, where the emergency signal indicator glowed red. He didn't smile. He didn't breathe easy, but he stood taller. That cockpit wasn't built for safety. It had become a vault of secrets, a fortress of survival, and now, the last ground from which truth could be launched. The sounds of Redden's assault dulled slightly. The cockpit had become a silence chamber, a place where Arven could finally speak through action. From behind the door came another slam. From the console came another blink. From the man came one thought. If they wanted to use the cockpit to erase him, they had given him the one place they could no longer control. And so Arven Kassel gripped the blood-stained axe, looked toward the locked barrier he had now claimed as his own, and whispered not in defeat, but in purpose. They wanted the cockpit locked from me. Now it's the only place I can fight back from. The aircraft jolted violently as a wall of turbulence slammed into its wings without warning, sending drink cups, loose phones, and trays skidding across the cabin. Passengers cried out, grabbing for armrests as oxygen masks dropped from the overhead panels with a hiss. The lights flickered in stuttering bursts, casting the cabin in brief flashes of white and shadow. In that moment of chaos, Redden Cole lost his footing. The sudden tilt of the aircraft hurled him backward, and the emergency axe, still clutched in his slick, bloodied hands, smashed into his chest as he struck a row of seats. The sharp clang of the axe handle hitting metal echoed through the cabin like a war drum. But instead of silencing the passengers, it galvanized them. Darren Valcor, now standing with his phone held high, shouted into the chaos, "This whole thing's recorded. He's saving us. The CEO's flying the plane." His voice cut through the noise like a blade, snapping stunned passengers out of paralyzed fear. Gasps turned into outrage. Shock morphed into defiance. A middle-aged man in seat 9D stood up, then another in 12F. Merrick Solvor tried to bark orders from the galley, his voice cracking with strain. "Remain seated. This is a federal containment procedure." But no one listened anymore. The spell of control had broken. Passengers surged forward down the aisle, anger and adrenaline replacing fear. Merrick attempted to flee toward the rear, but a quick-thinking group of men blocked his path, dragging him down with belts, torn seat fabric, and raw determination. One of them, a retired firefighter, tied Merrick's hands behind his back with the plastic tubing from a fallen oxygen mask. Redden, disoriented but not finished, staggered toward the cockpit door, eyes wild. Blood streaked his forehead. He slapped the intercom button beside the entrance, voice ragged and desperate. "Dr. Kassel, they'll erase you when we land. You don't understand the system you're fighting." His hand trembled over the button as though hoping his words could still twist the truth. Inside the cockpit, Arven Kassel sat hunched forward in the pilot's seat, every muscle in his back taut from the storm of responsibility pressing against him. His ribs burned with every breath. His split lip trembled from exertion, and his fingers pulsed with raw pain as they hovered over the controls. Yet his focus didn't waver. He pressed the intercom reply button, his voice low and steady. "I built the system, and I know how to collapse it." As he released the switch, the indicator lights on the primary console flashed. A ping pulsed across the screen, confirmation that his earlier transmission on the buried emergency band had finally locked with ground control. On the lower monitor, a response signal blinked. "Escort inbound. Code White Level 2 confirmed." Arven inhaled deeply through his nose, eyes locked on the data feeds stabilizing one by one. Altitude, 18,000 feet. Rate of descent normal. External comms secure. Remote override severed. Inside the cabin, muffled through the reinforced door, the thudding sounds of restraint and rebellion intertwined. Redden's shouts, passengers shouting over one another. The distinct hum of rebellion that grew with every second they remained in the air. He turned toward the mounted cockpit camera, a tiny lens that now served as his witness to the world, and steadied himself. His shirt was torn at the collar. Blood dried in a thin line down his cheek. The axe sat beside him, blood-stained, dented, yet unmistakably whole. He reached for it, not to wield it, but to keep it in frame. "I'm Dr. Arven Kassel," he said, voice controlled but burning. "And I am not dead. Flight 907 was hijacked, and I want the world to know who tried to erase me." The wheels of SkySpan Flight 907 shrieked as they struck the runway at Barriston Field, the force jolting every soul on board. The moment the aircraft's body settled into its deceleration, the passengers held their collective breath, then erupted into stunned, raw applause. It wasn't from mere relief. It was recognition. recognition that something extraordinary had unfolded thousands of feet above them, something no airline could spin, redact, or bury. Outside, floodlights bathed the airstrip in sterile white as a wall of armed federal ground crews formed around the aircraft. Their formation was not aggressive, but cautious, like responders approaching a crime scene where the threat was not entirely extinguished. The screeching rotors of surveillance drones echoed faintly in the distance. The air around the field pulsed with unspoken urgency. Inside the cockpit, Dr. Arven Kassel sat motionless. Blood streaked his shirt, his fingers were stiff around the yoke, and a deep gash throbbed along his jawline. Yet his eyes remained clear. He waited, breathing slowly, watching the instrument panel until the final green light, ground confirmation locked, clicked on. Only then did he rise. With slow precision, Arven unlocked the cockpit door and stepped into the dimmed cabin, where silence fell like a dropped curtain. He limped forward, one hand holding the blood-stained emergency axe, the other gripping the gutted relay core, the mechanical heart of the hijack. The visual stunned everyone. Not a rescuer, not a victim, but a commander of calamity, walking through the wreckage still standing. Redden and Merrick had been subdued just moments earlier. 3 federal air marshals, dispatched mid-flight through a secured rear airlock after Arven's emergency override transmission, had swiftly taken control. The crew never saw them board. Redden had lunged one last time, only to be tackled, zip-tied, and slammed against the rear galley. Merrick had tried to talk his way out, claiming compliance until footage on Darren Valcor's phone revealed the full truth. Outside the plane, a black SUV rolled toward the aircraft, stopping just shy of the wing. The door opened, and out stepped Rylan Vesk, a federal aviation inspector known for his silence and surgical precision. He climbed the boarding stairs as the aircraft's internal lights flickered back to full brightness. When he reached the top and locked eyes with Arven, he didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, with an almost reverent disbelief, "You flew a hijacked plane with a severed nav relay and half your ribs broken." Arven didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man, the growing crowd of uniformed agents behind him, then extended the blackened relay module forward. His voice was low but firm. "Start here." Rylan took the device with care, as if it were evidence from a battlefield. The passengers had begun to deplane, but many turned back to watch. They weren't rushing to the tarmac, they were witnessing a closing chapter. Emergency medics tried to approach Arven, one even raising a stretcher, but he waved them off. Pain etched every movement, but his posture remained upright, defiant. At the bottom of the steps, Darren Valcor, still clutching his phone, ran forward, voice raw with adrenaline and certainty. "He saved all of us," Darren shouted. "Don't let them spin this." His cry carried across the airstrip like a spark catching dry grass. Other passengers echoed the sentiment, murmurs of, "That's him," and "He fought them off with an axe," rippled across the gathering cluster of responders. The story had already begun escaping containment. On the far edge of the runway, sleek black sedans from SkySpan Holdings arrived, executives and legal reps emerging in suits and earpieces. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They watched. Their silence was a confession too loud to ignore. The scene shifted from landing to reckoning. Media had not yet arrived. No reporters, no flashing cameras. But every passenger still held a phone. Every file, every image, every scream, every act of survival was captured and ready to burn through the digital world. And SkySpan, Carnexus Systems, whoever had orchestrated this, would no longer be able to redact it into silence. Above the door to the aircraft, the flight number glowed faintly, 907, but it no longer symbolized just a route. It was now a number etched in history, a code for the night a man hijacked back control from those who tried to erase him. Arven stood there for a moment longer, his hand tightening around the axe handle. His breathing was labored, but steady. The wind tugged at his torn sleeve. His mind wasn't on his wounds, it was on the chain of decisions that brought them all here. He looked once more at the silent SkySpan officials on the tarmac, then toward the hangar, where spotlights glinted against the hulls of other jets, vessels still flying under the illusion of safety. The story was no longer under their control. It was now a matter of record. The fallout began not with a press conference, but with a lie. 48 hours after Flight 907's emergency landing, SkySpan Holdings issued a brief statement from its headquarters, framed beneath corporate banners and spoken by a pale-faced communications officer reading from a teleprompter. Preliminary findings suggest a rare mechanical malfunction resulted in limited crew coordination issues. SkySpan regrets any passenger distress and is cooperating fully with aviation authorities. The statement was cold, sterile, crafted to bury questions beneath layers of jargon. But the internet didn't wait. By the time the press conference ended, the first videos had already gone viral. Darren Valcour's recording, shaky, breathless, raw, opened with the crash of a tray, followed by the blur of Redden Cole's form lunging forward with an axe. Another clip captured Merrick Solvor blocking the aisle, declaring a security breach, while Arven Kassel, bloodied but upright, dragged himself into the cockpit. Within hours, a full timeline stitched together by passengers began circulating online. Dozens of angles, dozens of voices. Not even SkySpan's top crisis consultants could halt the surge. The footage was damning. It showed not just violence, but intent. Arven's shirt stained dark across the shoulder, the sound of his voice delivering the emergency override message, the slammed cockpit door, the glint of the axe wedged into the locking mechanism. Narratives spun by SkySpan collapsed like paper under flame. At Veylorix Dynamics, Arven's communications team remained silent, following one instruction he had given them before being taken into medical evaluation. "Don't defend me. Let the truth speak first." And it did. News stations rotated clips by the hour. Independent investigators began tearing into aircraft registry logs. Aviation experts pointed out the improbability of a mechanical malfunction, disabling both communications and cockpit security while also coinciding with the use of an illegal relay core. Then came the bombshell. A former Carnexus systems engineer anonymously leaked documentation showing prototype schematics of a control suppression module, one nearly identical to the relay found on Flight 907. The device, initially dismissed by Carnexus as a non-functional research artifact, was proven operational. Serial numbers matched. Wiring configuration aligned. The financial trail began to emerge. A shell logistics firm tied to Carnexus had paid large consulting stipends to a group of unnamed contractors, two of which were later confirmed as Redden Cole and Merrick Solvor. Within 72 hours, federal agents raided the operations divisions of both SkySpan Holdings and Carnexus Systems. The footage of the raid, suits hustled out, files seized, servers boxed, was broadcast live. Boardrooms that once echoed with confidence fell eerily silent. Arven, meanwhile, remained out of sight. He was recovering. Bandages wrapped tightly across his left hand. 4 ribs taped. A slight tremor in his jaw when he spoke, but the words never wavered. When the summons came from the National Aviation Integrity Tribunal, he accepted without hesitation. The hearing chamber was circular, ringed with tiered wood panels and government officials seated beneath brass placards. Reporters waited outside. No camera crews were permitted inside, only transcripts. Arven walked in wearing a charcoal black suit, a simple gray tie, and a dark wrap over his injured hand. As he took his place at the central desk, the room stilled. The lead commissioner cleared his throat. "Dr. Kassel, thank you for coming. We understand you are still recovering." Arven raised a hand slightly. "I am, but this couldn't wait." What followed was not a performance, but a surgical accounting. He described every detail of the flight, the cockpit's sabotage, the hidden relay, the sequence of crew movements, and the moment the axe was raised. He clarified that he had not retaliated out of rage, but calculation. He explained the transmission channel he used, a hard-coded fallback buried deep in the aircraft's legacy architecture. He described why the system allowed it, and how most modern crew weren't even aware such pathways still existed. A younger commissioner interrupted, skeptical. "Dr. Kassel, why not wait? Why not isolate, call for help, and let the authorities intervene?" Arven looked up. His voice didn't rise. His tone didn't harden, but his words carried like stone across glass. "Because I was the only one inside the storm who remembered the sky was ours to protect." A pause, deep, crushing, then silence. The tribunal chamber didn't erupt in applause, it wasn't that kind of room, but the air shifted. The questioner looked down. Several pens stopped scribbling, and behind the sealed doors, even those who had questioned his decisions began to understand them. That night, a senator stepped out of the chamber into a wave of press microphones. He wore a sober expression as he glanced at the flashing cameras. Then he said, clearly and simply, "Dr. Kassel didn't just save a flight. He reopened the cockpit door on corporate sabotage." 3 months later, the axe gleamed under the overhead lights, sealed behind a crystal panel at center stage. Its blade, once stained and splintered, had been cleaned, restored, and mounted, not to glorify violence but to remind the world of what nearly happened aboard Flight 907. The conference hall, packed with officials, engineers, reporters, and agency delegates, pulsed with tension. Everyone knew this wasn't just a launch, it was a reckoning. Dr. Arven Kassel stood at the podium beneath the deep blue banner marked with a single sigil, a silver shield with the inscription, Aegis Corridor Initiative. He adjusted his jacket subtly. The sling on his left arm was gone, but the stiffness in his shoulder remained, buried under tailored fabric and focused silence. Behind him, giant screens cycled through live footage from flight simulators, schematics of the new cockpit override system, and a newly encoded pilot authentication interface. But none of it matched the weight of the object sitting just 6 feet behind him, the axe. He didn't begin with thanks or greetings. He began with the truth. Some tools are made for safety, others for destruction, and some, like the one behind me, start as one and end as another. His voice was steady, clear, but his eyes flickered toward the front row where government officials sat with folded hands and unreadable expressions. He knew many of them had once tried to bury the investigation in bureaucracy. But the footage from Darren Valcour, the footage that went viral across every platform, had made silence impossible. The public had already judged. Today was about consequence. 3 months ago, the cockpit was locked from the outside. Today, it opens from the inside with proof. The audience didn't move. Cameras clicked, screens lit up, but all eyes were still on him. Beside the stage, Darren Valcour stood quietly with a rolled document in hand, his testimony, signed and submitted to every state's aviation ethics board. He looked visibly changed since that day, no longer the nervous tech passenger, but a man who had become something else. Witness, whistleblower, voice. Arven motioned toward him. Darren Valcour, first public ethics witness under the Aegis Corridor Act. He didn't just press record, he preserved truth. Darren gave a small nod, lowering his eyes. The presentation continued. Arven's team, all male engineers and legal specialists, stepped forward in turn. Each presented a new protocol. The Federal Registry of Real-Time Crew Identification, cross-verified against a newly created federal database. An encrypted audit trail logging every override attempt, no longer stored only on the aircraft but mirrored to a protected satellite network. The Public Cockpit Lock Directive, requiring all future aircraft models to install emergency cockpit access verification linked directly to airspace integrity channels. Each protocol carried the same origin label, 907KASSEL. Arven had insisted that the numbers remain, so no boardroom, government body, or engineering floor would forget what forced these reforms into existence. Later, in a private corner backstage, Inspector Ryland Vesk approached Arven during a pause. Vesk had been the first federal authority to meet him at Barristan Field. He wore the same dark trench today, though his tone was softer. "You made it something permanent," Vesk said, glancing at the stage. "I had to," Arven replied. "If we called it a near miss, someone else would die the next time." Vesk hesitated. "You could have kept quiet, settled, retired." "I didn't survive a hijack to disappear," Arven said flatly. "I survived it to ensure no one else gets buried mid-air." The sentencing of Redden Cole and Merrick Solvor had just passed days earlier, 20 years each, no parole. Their final court statement revealed more than defiance. It exposed traces of encrypted transfers from shell accounts connected to Carnexus systems. It was damning, but still partial. The full financial trail remained under review, but the weight of the verdict had already broken Carnexus's back. The company's board announced dissolution the week prior, calling it a strategic withdrawal. Arven knew better. It was surrender. Back on stage, someone asked the question he knew would come. Why keep the axe visible? Why not archive it? He turned slowly toward the sealed panel. "Because some tools are forged for destruction, but reclaimed by survival," he answered, and he let the silence echo. The lights dimmed. The shield insignia glowed behind him. The initiative had launched, but its true work was just beginning. In the final moments of the ceremony, he stepped off the stage and joined his team in the front row. A younger engineer leaned over and whispered, "What if someone tries to stop the next one from launching?" Arven looked at him, tired but unwavering. "Then they'll learn something Redden never did," he said. The engineer blinked. "What's that?" Arven gave a faint nod toward the axe. "Some tools are forged for destruction, but reclaimed by survival." The hangar echoed with Arven Kassel's footsteps. He had stepped aboard the grounded SkySpan 907 airframe without ceremony, without press, and without anyone at his side. Just him, just memory, just silence. The cabin lights were off, but natural light from the high windows lanced across the empty seats like faint memories still trying to illuminate what had happened here. He didn't need a guide. His body remembered the exact rhythm of this aisle, the slight lean in the floor, the temperature drop near the bulkhead, the air pressure that had once carried betrayal and survival in the same breath. He stopped at seat 2A. The seatbelt still clicked with the same soft metallic sound. It had survived. So had the crack in the partition wall, jagged, faded, but stubbornly present. He reached out and touched it. The surface was cool. Still, it had been the place where Redden Cole's axe had driven him into the wall. The blow had fractured a rib and nearly severed the contract his company had fought years to earn. Arven sat slowly. The leather seat groaned beneath his weight. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered everything. The smell of burned circuitry in the cockpit, the wet warmth of blood from his palm, the surreal silence after the axe hit the ground. But above all, he remembered the fear in Redden's eyes when the passengers sided with truth. Across from him stood the cockpit door, no longer dented, no longer vulnerable. Now reinforced. Triple lock safeguards, aerospace-rated alloy bracing the seam, and just beside the doorframe, mounted clean and brushed in matte black, was the plaque. The Kassel lock, developed in response to Flight 907, installed worldwide. Arven's eyes locked onto it. That lock wasn't just a product. It was a promise, a silent guarantee that no cockpit would be silently sabotaged again, not without leaving a trail, not without a fight. His mind drifted, not to the axe itself, or to the tribunal, or to the threats, but to the moment he realized the plane had been designed to erase him, and how poetic it had felt to use the very axe meant for his demise as the tool of resistance. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath one releases when they finally return to the beginning. Then he spoke quietly, as if addressing the ghosts left behind. "You didn't close the door on me. You opened it for everyone." The click of the cabin door behind him broke the stillness. Arven stood, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the exit ramp. Outside the hangar, sunlight gleamed off a sleek new aircraft parked on the runway, a long, silver jet bearing the Aegis corridor crest. Just below the cockpit windows, it read, Veylor 1. Two technicians were performing routine checks, but one of them, a young engineer no older than 25, turned when he noticed Arven approaching. The young man stepped forward, hesitant but clearly respectful. "Sir, why did you never get rid of the axe?" Arven looked at him, then glanced down at his own hand, the faint scar across the palm still visible when the light hit just right. He let the question hang for a moment, studying the young man's earnest expression. Then, with a faint smile that carried more weight than words ever could, he answered, "Because the moment I did, people would stop asking what it was used for." Seconds later, the CEO stood, lifted the same axe meant to break him, and cut open the cockpit door to regain control of the flight. The attendant's confidence shattered, the crew froze, and the story became a national shockwave. If you believe real authority rises from pain with precision and power, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the moment ingenuity and composure confront arrogance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and standing up for justice in high-pressure situations.